So, Melissa, a very busy end to last week for the A's. And just to try and summarize, they had that meeting with the Coliseum. Apparently it went well. They're going to have another meeting down the road. But then the story came out actually from your publication, The Athletic, that Sacramento is now all of a sudden the front runner for those interim years. When you take a step back from all of that and try and figure out what's going on here, are we witnessing confusion or strategy play out in real time here?
I think if we were going to say strategy, we'd be giving a lot of credit to people who have not shown the ability to have a lot of strategy to this point. I mean, I think clearly there's messaging that's happening, right? Like there's no question that there's intent to try to get a message out there that, this is going to be where we're going to negotiate. Whether that message is coming from the A's or coming from Major League Baseball, I think remains to be seen, because I think there's probably two different forces at play here. What Major League Baseball is willing to give up and what the A's might be willing to give up, in order to stay at the Coliseum are probably two different things, I would have to say. Like, the idea of negotiating an expansion franchise is not really up to the A's, so messaging might be coming differently from Major League Baseball than it would from the A's. But I do think it would be giving a lot of credit to John Fisher to assume that he has a grand plan that's actually like two steps ahead of where we are, because there's been nothing that has shown that he's had that ability to this point.
At least from the Sacramento side, and I've been watching a little bit of news coverage and reaction from the 916. A lot of Sacramentans believe that if they do this, if they take part in this and hosting the A's for 3 or more years, it might be Sacramento's kind of opportunity or tryout to show that they can have a Major League Baseball franchise successfully. I'm not sure that that's the exact scenario that baseball would be thinking. Like, this is actually a legitimate tryout for Sacramento. What's your take on the Sacramento side of it, how they might feel? And obviously, you're well aware they went through the whole King saga of relocation recently.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing because it's obviously been both an A's and a Giants market for a long time, right? Like,
right.
You've had an affiliate there for both of those teams since 1999. There was always this intent that stadium could eventually kind of become a big league stadium. I think originally when it was built, there was this idea you could like tack on a third deck to it and essentially create, a major league stadium out of. I'm going to keep calling it Raleigh Field. I know it's not anymore, but that, there was always this idea that West Sacramento area could kind of grow up to become this bigger thing. I'm not going to say that Sacramento couldn't be a major league city. I think certainly when you look at the other cities in consideration, it matches up with size. It certainly matches up with medium market and, certainly the number of people that could be going there. I don't think, though, that this would necessarily present it as the best case for making that sort of pitch to Major League Baseball. They're not going to be playing in a big league stadium. It's not like it's going to be able to draw 30,000 people, a day. They're not necessarily going to have it, in their media market. It's going to basically, I would assume, either stay with the current situation or, depending on what the station decides to do, not be on the air at all. So I think, I don't know that it would really be an audition. That being said, if Major League Baseball was asking Sacramento to give them a favor in this case, then certainly that would play into its favor. But there would be so much work that would have to be done. And I don't know if there's an appetite necessarily from that side of it from Sacramento to build a major league stadium yet. Like, you see what's going on in Portland, you see what's going on in Salt Lake City. I haven't seen that in Sacramento. So I don't know if there is that backing, because it's going to be, a $1.5 billion project wherever it's going to be. And you need a lot of people to support that for that to happen.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions whether they could ultimately even produce a Major League Baseball stadium. It's a government town, right? Not necessarily a business town in Sacramento. So that's one side of it. Some Sacramentans also feel like, hey, if we get the A's and things fall through in Vegas, then we get to keep the A's, right? So that's one part of it. And kind of on that note, these interim years are interesting because the way I look at it is if you're Oakland and if you lose the A's, even for the interim, right? They're taking a step out the door. They're kind of moving out of mom and dad's house. And I don't think they're coming back. Like, even if Las Vegas fell through or anywhere else fell through, I think the moment they move out of Oakland, even for an interim fashion, means they're never coming back or existing there again. Do you believe the same way?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing in history that has seen a team leave somewhere and come back to it except for the Oakland years, which I guess, I mean, if it happens in one city again, then it can happen again. Although I don't know that that's a saga anyone wants to repeat, and unless you're the JPA, which they seem to be willing to do anything to go back in time. But yeah, I mean, I think once a team has vacated an area, it certainly creates a precedent that they're gone. And you sort of become a memory, a footnote, as opposed to an actual major league city. So I would think that the A's story would probably be done if they left. Now, that doesn't mean baseball would be done in Oakland, but right. I think the story would probably be done.
Going back to that A's meeting with the City of Oakland, County of Alameda, and the JPA for the Coliseum, the Joint Powers Authority, we knew that one of the requests from Oakland was going to be the promise of a future expansion team in Oakland. You knew that was going to be asked of the City of Oakland towards Major League Baseball. Why do you think it's so difficult for baseball to just satisfy that request and give that promise? Because if you think about it, like, baseball approved relocation so quickly and minus so many details, you'd have to think that in either equal time or even quicker time, if they really wanted to, they could grant expansion to Oakland.
They could. The interesting thing, of course, is that expansion has to come in pairs, right? So you can't
Correct.
have one expansion franchise, you have to have two. And they haven't committed yet to what that second expansion franchise would be. Now, obviously, Nashville's made a huge pitch for it. It always has been sort of the assumption that one would come from the West and one would come from the East, and that would certainly be there. But if it's not physically lined up yet and guaranteed, I think it's hard to make a guarantee to one city without the guarantee of the other. So that might be part of it. I think also, there's going to be an expansion fee that comes along with this, which is, partially why the whole Las Vegas thing has been so befuddling, because they're giving up this expansion fee that they would get in theory from somebody who was wanting to put that down for a Las Vegas franchise. I do think that there is something to be looked into there, in the sense that maybe there was no one willing to pay an expansion fee in Las Vegas, that, that amount of money is very significant just to get your foot in the door. And then you've got to deliver on this whole thing. And they really want to get into Vegas because the NBA is going to want to get in there. The NFL and obviously hockey are already there. So there may be some things in play there, but obviously there's been buyers that have been willing to talk about buying the A's, and they're deep pocket buyers here. So one would think it wouldn't be hard to find a Bay Area investor that would be willing to pay that expansion fee. But I do think that part of this is because that expansion idea keeps moving down the road, right? You're now talking about 2030 is likely, maybe 2035.
Right.
The commissioner's saying it's not going to happen before he's out of office. So as that keeps moving down the road, I think it's harder to promise something that may not ever really happen, to be honest.
Well, it's kind of an interesting value proposition too, right? If the A's are worth 1 point something billion, I know the Orioles were just 1.725, but then the expansion fee is reported as about 2 billion. So there's that cost difference of, well, which way is the better, cheaper, more efficient option? Anyway, let's go to the state of Nevada and more temporary season talk. So we know that Reno is basically out. The A's have had no contact with the minor league team there. Which is also kind of interesting because during the Nevada legislative session, it was almost promised that the A's would land temporarily in Nevada somehow, some way. Either Reno or Summerlin, where their AAA affiliate, the Aviators, play just west of Las Vegas. I mean, the A's discussed Summerlin so widely back in 2023. What do you think has happened now that, according to the Las Vegas Review-Journal, Summerlin is not an option for the A's in these temporary years? What happened maybe on the A's part, why they've changed their mind and tune on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the television contract is certainly part of it. If it really is $70 million a year, they're not going to get that in Nevada. And, I think their only hope for a media fee that's going to be somewhat equivalent to that is this future for Major League Baseball to be all streaming, which I think is something that eventually the league is trying to move towards, especially with the bankruptcy that you've seen from the RSNs from some of the other areas. That once all their franchises are no longer tied to networks, they can kind of come up with something similar to what you've seen for some of these other sports. But until that point, there's nothing in Nevada that can pay what a Bay Area media market can pay. So, if that's playing a big part of it, I think that's certainly maybe something that they hadn't really done a lot of homework on. And then all of a sudden they looked at the reality of, oh my gosh, we're going to give up this money and we can't get it for those 4 years. And we have no way of making that back. But also part of it could be really that, the state of Nevada just paid, I can't remember, I think it was $50 million. I was there for the opening weekend of Las Vegas ballpark, and I think they said it was $50 million to build that ballpark. It was a huge investment. It was a huge investment for the Las Vegas AAA team. And to have a big league team kind of come in and sort of shove it aside, especially the affiliate of that team, it does seem a little bit like disingenuous to the owners of the Las Vegas Aviators that just did all this to build this team. So it could be that behind the scenes, they sort of were like, we don't really want you to kick us out of our ballpark. Why the River Cats are willing to play that game, I'm not entirely sure. But I could see that the Aviators would find that to be, because it's going to be a hard draw to say, come to our ballpark to see the major league team, and then next week come and see the AAA team. I mean, I know those players tend to kind of go back and forth, but it's difficult to sell those tickets. And I think you devalue the product, and they're already going to devalue it by moving a major league franchise just down the road in a few years. To steal that cash cow early, seemed a little bit off to me from the beginning.
I always think impressions are important. And if you go to Las Vegas in 2025 or Summerlin, excuse me, and you're not really ready to make that first impression yet, you're going down there with a 65, 70 win team, and you're not even in your new stadium. I actually think it has something to do with the image side of it. As much as anything else, the A's just aren't ready to be in the Las Vegas metro area as soon as 2025. Let's switch gears and talk about the A's social media blackout. Not entirely, but mostly the frequency of posts on all the different platforms has gone way, way down. But also the cutting off of comments, that fans can't even comment on the A's posts. And I know this may seem trivial to a lot of viewers, and you watch this and say, that's not a big deal. But I don't know in our social media era, let's say of the last 15 years, any pro team across any league, in any sport, in any country across the world, I don't know that this has ever been done before at all or this long by a pro sports team. Am I making a big deal out of this? Is this no big deal? Is this just part of the equation that they're in right now? How do you see that?
I think it's more of a symptom of what has been an illness they've brought upon themselves. I think, I do feel very badly for the people that work on that account. They are not responsible for any of the things that have happened. Most of them are just, sort of fresh out of school. This is a job that they got that they're, trying to put up there, and they're kind of deluged with these comments that have nothing to do with them. So, I get it. But I also think, if you work in the social media field, probably just don't read the comments, which I think any of us who work in media, we've gotten very used to just don't read the comments. But on the flip side of that, I think this is really just a symbol of the fact that, this couldn't have been handled worse. It really couldn't have. The announcement was made, and it was as if they just decided as soon as they made the announcement, everyone was just going to be like, okay, yeah, we get it. Okay, we'll move on. And we're going to have to do nothing to try to assuage anyone, make anyone feel any better. And they've just sort of been mean. I think that's a lot of it, is they've been really mean to the people who had really worked closely with them as fans for a very long time, who had put a lot of love and heart into the team for a very long time. And those people are hurt, and they have every right to be. And so what you're seeing now is, I think I've said this somewhere else, but it's equivalent of breaking up with someone over voicemail, but then living in the house with them for 2 years, right? Right. It's not it's not like they left. And so I don't know why it was handled this way, but the longer that this goes on, and the more mean-spirited it's had to get, because people are so hurt, and there's been no attempt to try to reconcile it all. This is just where it was always going to inevitably end up. I do think, though, that ultimately they're the professionals, and they should be able to rise above it and ignore the noise and just be a normal social media presence. But I do think it's really a symptom of something that just never had to get to this point.
And along that same line, I think what Commissioner Rob Manfred said the other day about, the market still has the Giants, and he didn't flat out say it, but he certainly insinuated it, that, you should just go ahead and transition for A's fans to be Giants fans. It's not that hard. And you know what? As much as A's fans would take offense to that, I think that sends a broader message to Angels fans, White Sox fans, Mets fans, Orioles fans. What does that mean for them? I just think that was an across-the-board, really insensitive thing for the commissioner to say.
Absolutely. And it's also a deep misunderstanding of this market. It's a deep misunderstanding of how fandom works, which I think is something that has really been very evident from this commissioner, that he doesn't really understand what it means to be a fan. He might understand what it means to be the business side of baseball, but I would guess he's never truly been a fan of any sports team in the passionate way that you feel like, you understand where that's coming from. And I do think there is a real misunderstanding of this market from the East Coast base of Major League Baseball. I think there's a sense that the Bay Area is smaller than it really is, I think, from a lot of them. I think there's this idea that it is like, oh, geographically, there's only 10 miles apart between them. Therefore, it's like basically like they're neighbors. And, they're not neighbors in any way. Like, I think people who identify themselves as Giants fans and people who identify themselves as A's fans, they're coming from different worlds. And you understand that more inherently, I think, when you're in New York and you know what it means to be a Mets fan as opposed to a Yankees fan, and the same in Chicago. And I don't think they get it here. I don't know that they get it in LA either, to be honest. I think that's an interesting one. And I think perhaps one of the other things that we, going back to the whole idea of relocation and versus expansion, is you have a very unstable situation in Anaheim as well. I think we haven't really talked too much about it.
Right.
But, they have nowhere else to rebuild. Artie Moreno has basically like blown up that whole relationship with the city of Anaheim. And, are they going to stay? Is Chicago, are the White Sox going to stay if that whole kind of pie in the sky thing that they're trying to build on the loop doesn't fall through? If that falls through, they may be saving Nashville for relocation. So there's a lot of moving parts here. But I do think there's not a real understanding of the Bay Area market from the home office of Major League Baseball. And I think, the Giants, to the extent that they've taken advantage of that and talking to the commissioner, have probably been like, hey, we're here, we can do this whole thing.
Right.
And I think that is, very much a tone deaf thing to say here. I mean, it's a tone deaf thing to say even in Sacramento. Like, you wouldn't say, oh, the Kings are leaving, so you could be Warriors fans. Like, that's right. That would never, ever happen.
Just apply it anywhere else, and it sounds awful. So that's why it sounds awful in this case. And I don't remember the last trip that Commissioner Manfred made out here to the Bay Area. It's been a while since
2019 wild card, maybe.
Yeah, it's been a while. So, I wish you and I were having this conversation just to talk about baseball. Like, I wish none of this stuff actually existed, but it has presented to us at the forefront. It's so important. It's more than baseball, but the tandem of these two things, the relocation effort and baseball, I feel like up to this point, Mark Kotze, David Forst, they've done a tremendous job at keeping the baseball stuff separate, right? Away from relocation and separate the two entities. But it does seem like in the course of the last year, and maybe this winter, the relocation stuff really leaked over into the baseball side. And the fact that David Forst does not have a free agent signing from this past winter that's into even 2025. There are no players under contract right now for 2025. I feel like it has officially leaked over into the effect of affecting the baseball side of things.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, whether they would have been able to bring in any free agents or not, given how bad they were last year and the state of things, I think remains to be seen a little bit. But I mean, how do you sell this to a Major League Baseball player? Like, how do you say to us, come here on a contract that is equivalent to you being a valuable baseball player, and you're going to play at a AAA ballpark for at least a year or however many years you've signed? I mean, that's the difference between a Major League ballpark and a AAA ballpark. I can't quite explain this enough. Like, and like the ballparks in Sacramento and Las Vegas are very nice AAA ballparks. Like, I love watching games there, but those locker rooms are nothing like the locker room at the Oakland Coliseum. And we can talk about the Oakland Coliseum being old and being run down, whatever. That is a huge locker room. They've got all the amenities right there. There's a batting cage right next to it. It's a big league city. Like, there's so much that goes into being a big leaguer that isn't beyond what we see when we're on the field. And to take that away and say, oh, but we'll give you $10 million when you could get $10 million from someplace that's not going to have that issue, I just don't see how you compete with that. Like, if they went and paid double, maybe they could, but John Fisher's not going to write that check. So I think that was never going to happen anyway. But absolutely, like, the narrative around the team right now even with the fact that I think a lot of players would play for Marcotte under a lot of circumstances. But I think that it's too negative to want to make a long-term commitment to. So you see, guys like, I think Ross Stripling was fine with coming over in a trade. I think Alex Wood was fine with coming over for a year. A year is one thing, but when you're talking about 2 to 3 years and not knowing where your family's going to live, not knowing where all that stuff, like, it's hard enough to be a Major League Baseball player and know you could be traded any minute. To be a nomad, I think, is just way too much on it. So absolutely. And, I think that the abruptness at which the last core was torn down and the timing of when that happened too. So you're coming out of a COVID year, you're coming out of a situation where people couldn't scout the way they normally do. So you're going off of old reputations when you're talking about evaluating players. The packages that came back didn't live up to what they had expected, even though I think if you looked at the makings of those deals, they were very similar to the makings of deals that had been made before. But you didn't have the intel that you normally do when you're, getting those players. So that didn't happen. And I think if it looked like it was a team that was on the rise, maybe you could ignore some of that stuff. But you're looking at a team that, has so many questions, not a lot of depth in the minor leagues, and a situation where they have no stable home. Like, how do you sell that? I don't know how you would ever sell that to anybody.
The scouting effect from the pandemic, you just brought it up. That is tremendous. I think I had maybe heard that somewhere along the line, but that is such a great point. And even you're right, what the A's did and didn't get back in those suddenly forced trades. I also think about just the course of this upcoming baseball season. And a lot of these players, the young players that have come up through the system, and now they're here in Oakland. And this is not the way they want to live their big league existence. Zach Geloff wants to talk about going 3 for 4, not, hey, I'm, so-and-so from Houston media. Are you guys moving to Las Vegas? And I do think that this year, more than any other season, A's players are going to get bombarded every city they go, because relocation now is kind of on the national radar for the Oakland A's. This is kind of what they're known for. And I don't know, I guess what I'm saying is, from the player perspective, I don't think this upcoming year and the coming years are going to be very fun for them at all.
Yeah, it's hard, and I think one of the things I've really admired about Marcotte is that he has been able to create this sort of, this is who we are. We're going to be in this clubhouse together. He's been willing to answer all the hard questions, so he hasn't left it to his players. I do think, though, it'll be interesting to see if anyone can step into that void that Tony Kemp really filled last year. I think he was a veteran player that was also able to take on a lot of that, because you don't want to ask that of someone like Zach Geloff or Lawrence Butler, who was just trying to get in. Even a Nick Allen, who's only been here for a couple of years, like, that isn't fair to them. And they also aren't in a position to really answer honestly. Like, these are guys that need to establish themselves as big leaguers, and you don't want them to be in a position, even as a media person, you don't want to see somebody lose a career over saying something that they shouldn't have in this sort of situation, because, it's one thing if you're Juan Soto and you say something like that, but if it's another thing, if you're like, scraping for a roster spot and all of a sudden owners look at you as somebody who's going to be, a problem. So I think it's tough. I do think Kotze's done a great job of creating an us versus them, not meaning the fans, but an us versus the rest of the league sort of mentality, a focus on what you can control. So I think it'll be a lot of that, but it is hard. I mean, this is the start of spring training. Like, I love this time of year, and you don't get to think about the baseball. Like, I look back the last year, I don't think I wrote about baseball like half as much as I wrote about the other stuff, which sucks. Like, this is why we get into it. We want to write about baseball. And that's just not the story right now surrounding this team, which is just so unfortunate.
My trip to Mesa upcoming is going to be different than any other one of the dozens and dozens I've made. This one is going to hit and feel a lot different. Well, you mentioned it. And in terms of fan appetite, and you're doing a lot of work and you've covered this team in baseball for a long time, it's almost as if, like, do you get fan response from articles and stories about the team and the game and stats and baseball anymore? Or is pretty much almost everything you have to do centering around the future of the team? How do you get the response from The Athletic in your work? What type of feedback do you get on what fans are actually interested in most here?
Yeah, I mean, the readership for the relocation stories is significantly higher than it is about the baseball stuff. I think in part because that's a bit of a national story too. So you're getting people who are not just A's fans that are clicking on those stories. But Certainly I did a story on the Ballers last week, and that did, better than the last three stories I've done on the actual A's roster, which, is, I mean, this is a Pioneer League team that hasn't played a game yet. So now that may speak to my reach as a writer, but I think there is this, until you make the team compelling, people are not necessarily going to want to read about it. But there's also this people really would come back to reading about the team. If tomorrow they announce, listen, sorry, this was a terrible mistake. We're staying here. We're rebuilding. The interest in the team would come back immediately. You see it with they'll post a highlight of Zach Geloff or something, and they'll be this love-hate thing where you're you don't want to say anything nice about the A's, but man, we really like that player. And, we don't want the players to think we don't like them. We really love them. We love the idea of the team separate from what's happening with the ownership of the team. So you do get that tension. You see it in the comments a little bit, and there are people that are going to love this team regardless. There are some people that are going to stick through it, but for the most people, this is just a really painful, long goodbye, I think, at this point.
Yeah, it's the slowest motion relocation I think I've ever seen in the history of professional sports, which doesn't happen often, obviously, by the way. A 60-win team 2 years ago, 50 wins last year. When you look back at their winter, some additions, some subtractions. I don't know if there was anything particularly notable either way in terms of those. So not maybe a different team. You hopefully see a lot of maturation with the young players. Maybe that makes them better. But how do you see this team projected for 2024? Much better, much worse, any different?
I mean, I think the pitching will be better, which is a huge thing, right? They dug themselves into a huge hole last year because the pitching just fell apart from opening day, essentially. And I think bringing on those two veteran starters will be helpful. The bullpen's a little bit unsettled, but if Mason Miller can stay healthy, anchoring the back end of that bullpen, should be, pretty exciting, frankly. He's as good an arm as they've probably ever had there. There is some depth from some of the younger guys that are going to come, up, like Luis Medina and people like that had no experience before that, are going to come in there. So if they can throw more strikes, I mean, I can't. Last year was frustrating for so many reasons, but the biggest thing was that they just couldn't throw strikes. And that's such a not A's thing, right? A's pitchers may not throw 100, but they throw strikes. So if they can get back to that, they should be more competitive than they were. I don't know that they'll necessarily be better. I don't see 50 wins, but I think you can see that needle moving a little bit more forward. Obviously, having Geloff for a full year will be helpful too in solidifying that middle infield. I feel like they might bring someone else in. There's a lot of players that are just sort of sitting there, and some of them may turn into one-year situations at this point because of where we are in the off-season, spring training, whatever. But I wouldn't expect them to be very good. That being said, the AL West right now, it's not a good division.
Good luck.
They're in the World Series, but they got worse in the offseason, I think. The Mariners I don't know. I mean, tomorrow they'll probably trade 6 guys, and then we'll have to reevaluate who they are. The Angels are obviously a lot worse than they were last year. So, I think there's a lot of we'll have to see. The Astros are every year you think this is the year that they're going to get old and sort of tip the scale, and then they turn out to win 100 games. But there could be more winnable games within the division than there were last year.
And just correlating the baseball success and struggles to any other off-field efforts by the A's, whether it's Las Vegas or Sacramento or Oakland, doesn't the baseball team itself actually have to start getting good? Doesn't the roster have to get invested in here pretty soon, pretty quickly, no matter what the total outcome is? If we really are talking about 2028 somewhere, and you want to go in with a bang and make a splash, when does that start? Because we're already at 24, and the team is not a whole lot different than a 50 and 60 win team right now.
Yeah, that's, I think, been the most puzzling thing to me. I mean, you look at the Kansas City Royals, right? And yes, they're trying to stay in market. I don't know if that makes a difference or not, but this is a team that was just as bad as the A's were last year, right? I think we forget that for some reason, but they lost 108 games or something. And, the A's don't necessarily have a Bobby Witt Jr. to give that money to yet, but they could have gone out and gotten a Hunter Renfroe, maybe. They could have gone out and done some of those Michael Wacha type moves, maybe. But there's been a reluctance to invest in the roster, and that's what you're selling, right? Like that's 100% what you're selling. And even back in 2020, like, if John Fisher knew this was the kind of deadline for when this was going to happen one way or the other for a new stadium, that his response was, "Oh, I can't afford this roster." What does that say? Like, I mean, it's nothing compared to the investment you're going to have to make in a stadium. So if you can't invest in Matt Chapman and Matt Olson, how are you going to invest in a $1.6 million ballpark? And I've never understood the sort of disparity between those two approaches at all, because yeah, if you're going to sell a car, you should clean it, right? Like you don't want to like show up with it not detailed and a dent in the back bumper. Like that thing's got to look as good as you've had it looking for the last 5 years. And they've basically left it out in the rain to rust. Like it's really weird.
I was thinking about flipping a house just now. That was a great analogy, selling a car. But like, imagine if you didn't even mow the lawn and the kitchen was dirty and you're doing an open house. It doesn't seem right. I guess I want to end the interview on the most positive note here possible. And Jenny Kavnar is now my colleague at NBC Sports. You interviewed me about this, which I appreciate the opportunity to make some comments on it, but I actually want to get your perspective, and especially the magnitude of this. The first female to assume a primary television play-by-play announcer job in Major League Baseball. I mean, this is groundbreaking. I'm like honored to be part of that just at NBC Sports, and we went in that direction. I told you my quote was, as soon as I knew she was interviewing, I was like, oh, she is definitely going to get the job. Like that background, that prestige, all that stuff. This is the perfect fit for us. But I want to give you the opportunity to react to something like that, because I'm sure it hits home to you very close as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's amazing. I don't know if people who grew up in this area remember the A's used to have a thing where you could call an inning and it would be recorded in a broadcast booth. It was like, you could buy into it. And so I think it was like my 10th birthday or something. I got to call an inning and the recorded thing. And I mean, what a dream. But it also didn't seem like anything that I could ever do, even as much as I loved baseball and I loved talking about baseball and writing about baseball. Like women didn't have that kind of role. And every single time you see somebody who steps into that role, it makes it more of a reality. And like, you see these coaches that are out on the field now, and they've got ponytails. They look like us. Like it makes such a difference to what you can assume your life can look like when you see somebody else taking that role on. It's inspiring. And the inspiring part about it is like someone like Jenny, like they earned it, right? Like this is not like some sort of thing where, right, oh, we had to find a woman to put in a role. This is someone who put in the work for so long, who people respect for her depth of knowledge, for her ability to call a game. And so that means more too, because like, this idea that like we can earn it and be there and that this is a real thing will continue to build next generations for people to do that on. And I'm so excited to hear her. I'm excited that, she's someone who can put Dallas in his place. I think that's fantastic, like that they already have a rapport like that. But I think it's, the future of sports has to be inclusive. I think that, what we saw last night with Steph Curry and Sabrina, like this idea that like those two individuals can be on the same stage is such an amazing thing. And it'll only make everything in our world better when we're all together like that. So I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled to meet her. I'm thrilled to listen to the games this year. It's going to be really awesome.
You summarized my whole quote better in 3 words. She earned it. That's what I was trying to say in a couple sentences of a paragraph. And I think too, credit to NBC. By the way, it's NBC Sports who has hired her for this opportunity. But I also think it makes the Rockies experience that much more valuable, because you don't get good at something, especially baseball play-by-play, without a ton of reps and opportunity to do that. So as much as the A's are getting credit here, we should also acknowledge the Rockies too, because she doesn't become a qualified, solid broadcaster nobody does without those opportunities. And that, I think, is what led to this opportunity here. So I think Absolutely. The Rockies deserve that.
And all those minor league broadcasters, there's women that are calling those games. That is such a grind, and you're listening, and sometimes your audience is a couple hundred people, and like the idea that tape matters, and that they can point to her now and say, look, like that year in the Cal League when there were 15 people listening to me on a live stream or whatever. But I got so good at it that there's a path for me. I think that opens up so many doors, and I think it's just wonderful news.
Melissa, I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you here. Obviously, I watch everything The Athletic does, but especially you. I know you have your finger on the pulse of the A's, so thank you for doing this. And if you don't mind, a couple weeks or months or whenever the situation dictates down the road, maybe we'll do it again.
Absolutely, anytime.